walking beneath the pine needle embroidered boughs and enveloped in the familiar cascading shadows of shade, I couldn't help but reminisce a little, mentally anyway. It wasn't until Mason asked me to tell him a little more about the place that I began uttering my thoughts out loud. Mason was a friend of the family. Well, a friend of my wife and her family from before I had met her. Her and Mason used to date, and although their outward relationship had long since passed, they had managed to stay friends for many years that followed. Being that her parents got along so well with him helped reinforce that relationship, without a doubt. I'll admit, for the majority of our time dating, I wasn't too keen on the idea of her ex always hanging around, but his constant presence and my new wife's insistence eventually led to tolerance. This would alternatively lead me to understand that in reality, Mason wasn't that bad of a guy. We had a lot of similar interests, like sports, hiking, and video games, and he never once had brought up his intimate relationship with his ex-lover, who was currently my spouse. I slowed my pace and started my response to his question, realizing just how much recalling the events of my childhood actually hurt. For a long time, I've just pushed those feelings away, refusing to deal with them, and that has seemed to work pretty well. But now, I was being forcing myself to recall, retell, and basically relive those happenstances. Well, honestly, man, I'd expected much of it to have changed by now, but it doesn't look like it has, I told him. Mason responded with,
"But you grew up here, right? You haven't been back for, what? You said something like 15 years, right? Why are we here now?"
He was right. I had avoided this place like the bubonic plague, and yet this was the location I insisted upon for our monthly venture. Typically, we'd drive north from the city, about an hour away from our homes into the wilderness, but this weekend we had driven south, at least twice the distance, to visit a place from my distant past. These woods appeared nearly exactly as I had last seen them, aside from the previous Wednesday when I had come here alone, but some things were for me to know only. Trees were tall, taller than most in this relatively arid climate. The forest floor was covered with leaves and sticks over top of loose, dry soil, and each looked as if they could have been the same leaves and sticks that had been in those very spots when I left with my parents so long ago. The roots of trees here disturbed the soil in a way that created sinkholes, both large and small, near their bases, giving the terrain a very ruddy appearance. I informed Mason to watch his step. Some of these pits were large enough to fit two of him. I saw an expression of awe on his face as he scanned his enveloping surroundings. Aside from complex root systems that jutted from the ground in places, the hike was pretty easygoing. Most of the holes were near the trunks of trees and generally avoided with ease. After a few deep breaths, so as to catch the wind behind my voice, I provided my well-plotted reply with, "My parents moved when I was about 15. I just haven't been back since. Mostly, I suppose, just because life gets so busy. You know what I mean?" I said, with more of a statement than a question, because he of course knew what I meant.
"Well, it sure is pretty here, man. I'm loving this fresh, dry air, I can tell you that. So, what the hell did you do around here anyway?"
Well, me and my friend Brandon used to play in these woods until he died in them. After that, I just kinda grew to detest them. Mason was quiet. I didn't need to turn and look at him to know that he was still trying to process what I had just said. I did anyway, though, and in doing so, proved my assumption correct. His brows were furrowed, and within his expression, confusion. I saw slight apprehension, the beginnings of fear. Good, I thought to myself privately.
What the fuck did you just say? Your friend just died out here.
I paused before speaking. Yeah, we were both pretty young. 7 or 8, if I remember right. I think Brandon was 8. He was a few months older than me.
Why haven't you mentioned this before? Does Lexa know?
He kept asking me one question after another. His mind was obviously reeling for answers. I thought of this, and it made me smile a bit. No, she doesn't, I responded flatly. I haven't mentioned it. Don't mention it. It's taken a long time to really deal with it, if you can understand that, I explained.
So...
He began, but I already knew what his next statement would be. I let him finish it anyway.
What happened?
He tried to ask, as gently as he could. I sighed before beginning my story. Out here, in the sticks, especially back then, there wasn't much to do. As you can imagine, this place, without the comforts of cell phones, digital TV, and the internet, we kinda had to make our own fun. We'd play army out here in the woods, each of us using small sticks, crudely shaped as a pistol, if you used your imagination, and spent so many afternoons engaged in arguments over who shot who and whether or not they had missed. Without the help of a system like laser tag or the sort, marksmanship was more or less a matter of personal judgment, and for 2 7- or 8-year-olds, personal judgments are basically based on opinion and whether or not it serves one's purpose. Sometimes we'd play tag or build forts. Other times, we'd play hide and seek. My voice trailed off as I said this last part, emphasizing the tone of the conversation as a somewhat somber one. I allowed another long and silent pause to pass between us, letting Mason interject with any comments he may have. He said nothing. I took this opportunity to scan my immediate surroundings for the landmarks I was looking for. They would go unnoticed by Mason. A fallen down log, a rock of no important but specific shape. I couldn't help but feel nostalgic being here. I was telling the truth after all. I haven't been back here for the better part of 2 decades, and I hadn't been in this forest, walking these trails, now concealed by time and leaves, since Brandon had died. Even after all that time, all that's happened between then and now, my memory of the route unfolded like the pages of a storybook. Each page was read and then turned to reveal another chunk of my memory resurfaced, unobscured by time, like I had remembered it all along, and this trend continued with each landmark and reminiscent object I passed. The trees and earth finally telling me that we were headed in the right direction, and we continued on. I told Mason to watch his step as we crossed under a large, looming tree and over the deep, ruddy holes between gnarled roots.
So, you never finished your story. You don't have to, but you've got me curious now.
I looked back at him for a moment with an assuring smile. I had no problem in telling him the rest. Him knowing the rest was of vital importance after all. Yeah, sorry about that. I guess recalling everything kind of flooded my mind for a minute there. It happened when we were playing hide and seek. It honestly was a day just like any other. There was no thundercloud or pervasive darkness. There was no ominous foreboding in the air that may have warned either of us. We were carefree, happy children. We were stupid. Kids don't listen to the warnings of parents. I guess that goes for adults too. I suppose just about everybody simply behaves and performs in ways that are self-serving, giving little more regard for unseen consequences of their actions than what is minimally required to take such an action. Take a look around you, Mason. This place is a haven for a child's games and imagination. I gestured my arm in such a way that it was as if I was presenting a great stage to behold before us. I watched Mason's eyes, taking in all that surrounded him. We were getting close, and I couldn't help but let the smallest, unnoticeable smile form on my face. Mason didn't see it. He was still admiring the natural beauty of the arid forest, and had a mind full of my story. I continued on. It was my turn to count, and Brandon's turn to hide. Obviously, I'm sure you can guess what we used to hide ourselves in. Both Mason and I eyed the bases of the trees, rising tall, adjacent to the darkened pits between their roots. I'm also sure you've heard the rules of hide-and-seek, and I didn't make it a habit of cheating, peeking, or rushing my count. But that day, I made an exception. As I counted out into the 90s, and neared 100, I heard a distant noise that sounded a lot like a wounded animal, like a dying cat. My ears pricked. I softened the sound of my counts and listened more intently, realizing after a few more shouts that it was no animal, not a cat like I had initially thought. It was Brandon. Wherever he was pretty far away, and his calls sounded quite distant. The exact direction from which they originated eluded me. The trees in a forest can play tricks with sound. The sound waves are obstructed, and they bounce around by the hills and the trees, depending on the parameters of the terrain. Sound refraction becomes normative in places. I spent maybe 5 minutes running through the forest, trying to find the source of his cries, and although I was still far off, I could tell I was getting closer. But then the worst thing that could have happened did. Brandon stopped screaming. I called out his name. I asked where he was. I must have searched by myself for over an hour. He never once responded back to me again. Looking back, I know it was too late. But I still can't help but wonder from time to time how things may have turned out different. If I had just cheated, or stopped counting early, or if I had just gone left instead of right, or so forth.
Jeez, man. I'm really sorry to hear that.
I could tell Mason wanted to say more. His mouth seemed to start forming words intermittently without sounds. I suppose, what can you say to someone after a story like that? Finally, we had reached the old tree I had been walking us towards. It wasn't any larger than the others surrounding it. There was nothing about it that conveyed speciality or sentiment. We came to rest beneath its tall, overhanging boughs, and Mason's voice finally found itself once again.
Why have we stopped here?
He inquired, somewhat out of breath and slightly bewildered, I was sure. I took the opportunity awarded by the pause and finished my tale. See, the thing is, Mason, Brandon died. Right here. The following day, a search party found him, cold as the ground that cradled him and lifeless. Take a look, I said, pointing to the base of the tree behind Mason. He turned to look, and once I was sure his footing was proper and his focus distracted, I lunged forward and gave him a push. Ass over tea kettle, Mason fell forward, trying to catch himself on the ground in front of him, only to discover a fall trap hidden well by thin branches and leaves. Mason crashed through with ease, landing on a pile of debris below. I heard a loud crunch and a yelp like that from a wounded dog. I leaned over the edge, and that malevolent grin once again graced my expression without my willingness. My plan had worked. The plan I had set into motion, the sharpened spear-like sticks I had placed at the bottom, had pierced one of Mason's legs. I watched for a moment as Mason struggled to get to his feet and out of the hole. It was no use.
What the fuck, man? Why?
he yelled up to me. I gave forth a slight chuckle, and now that I surely had his full and undivided attention, a captive audience, if you will, I told him the last part of my story, a piece that would prove quite significant to him. Fire ants, Mason. You know, if you listen close, you can hear them coming. Mason's eyes darted around in wide panicked frenzy, finally realizing the despair of his situation. You see, Brandon fell into that exact hole. Unlike you, however, Brandon twisted his ankle and had gotten caught in a tangle of those roots. He screamed as the ants devoured him slowly for a while, but eventually passed out from pain and toxin. Not the best way to go, I imagine. Also, unlike you, Mason, Brandon didn't deserve his fate. He was a true friend. I'll never forgive myself for what happened to him. But you, on the other hand, the thought of you down there, screaming for your life as you're eaten alive by insects, will be a comfort to me.
Wait, we were supposed to be...
I cut him off. What? Supposed to be friends? I genuinely laughed at him here. Do you sleep with all your friends' wives, or just the ones you used to date? I asked him. Mason started again, and again I cut him off. Shut up, Mason. Don't deny it. See, the other week when I came home from work early, I was going to surprise Lexa. You know, my wife. Well, surprise, surprise. Guess what I get an eye full of when I snuck through the front door that afternoon? I'll give you a hint. Screams and moans of ecstasy, the slap of flesh against flesh, and the sight of a naked ass pumping at the hips of my wife in my bed. Imagine my shock when I caught a glimpse of your face in the mirror. Again, Mason opened his mouth to talk, but not a sound fell past his lips. Now, if you'll excuse me, my friend, you and I both have appointments to keep. Without hesitation, I turned and walked away. Mason's screams for help became increasingly distant as I walked, softer with each step, until his cries for help turned into shrieks of agony and pain. The ants were doing their work, and I felt as though I had done a good thing, satisfied with my work. The only passing thought that crossed through my mind as I made the trek back to the car was how much my wife would love the scenery of this place when I bring her out here next weekend.